"Sir, you were warned to disperse. This is an unlawful assembly." The riot gear-clad officer's voice boomed through a bullhorn just before the crackle hiss of a taser split the air. 90-year-old Arthur Jenkins, a decorated World War II veteran leaning heavily on his walker, cried out as the electrical shock struck him. He collapsed onto the pavement, his protest signs scattered around him. He had simply been standing there, quietly holding a small flag. 8 minutes later, as fellow protesters shielded Arthur, the chaotic sounds of the demonstration were abruptly overshadowed by the silent, imposing arrival of a fleet of black SUVs. Stern-faced men in dark suits emerged, their presence unmistakably authoritative. If you believe the right to peacefully protest is sacred, especially for those who fought for it, type First Amendment below. Arthur Jenkins, at 90 years young, had witnessed more history unfold than most people ever read about. He had landed on bloody beaches in his youth, faced down enemy tanks, and returned home to a nation he had fought to protect, carrying both visible and invisible scars. His small apartment was a quiet testament to a life of service. A few carefully preserved medals in a glass case, photographs of his late wife Eleanor, and his comrades in arms, most now gone. His body was frail now, his steps aided by a four-wheeled walker adorned with a small American flag. But his spirit remained fiercely independent, his belief in his country's foundational principles unwavering. When he heard about the planned peaceful protest downtown, a gathering of concerned citizens, many elderly, protesting proposed cuts to veterans' health care benefits and Social Security, he felt a familiar call to duty. These weren't radical demands. They were about promises made, about dignity in old age. He donned his VFW cap, pinned a small replica of his Purple Heart to his modest windbreaker, and made his way slowly but resolutely to City Hall Plaza. His walker clicking rhythmically on the sidewalk, he wasn't there to cause trouble, only to bear witness, to add his presence to the call for justice. The protest was indeed peaceful. A few dozen people, mostly seniors, held handmade signs, "Honor your vets," "Keep your promises," "Health care, not warfare." They chanted softly and listened to speakers, a far cry from a riotous mob. The city, however, perhaps overreacting to online chatter or simply flexing its muscle, had dispatched a surprisingly large contingent of police in full riot gear. They formed a tight, intimidating line, shields up, batons visible, faces obscured by visors. Captain Miller, the officer in charge, a man known for aggressive crowd control tactics, seemed determined to disperse the small gathering quickly. "This is an unlawful assembly," Miller's amplified voice boomed across the plaza, even though the protesters had a permit and were on public property. "You have been warned to disperse. If you do not leave the area immediately, you will be subject to arrest and the use of force." Arthur Jenkins stood near the edge of the small crowd, leaning on his walker, his small flag held steady. He wasn't chanting, wasn't shouting, just standing his ground, a silent testament. Other protesters, mostly elderly, some with disabilities, looked nervously at the heavily armed police line but held their positions. They believed they had a right to be there. "This is your final warning," Captain Miller bellowed. "Disperse now." He gave a sharp nod to his officers. Several of them, including a young, nervous-looking officer named Peterson, advanced on the protesters, batons raised. Panic rippled through the small crowd. Some started to back away, but others, including Arthur, stood firm, bewildered by the sudden escalation. Officer Peterson, perhaps caught up in adrenaline or misinterpreting Captain Miller's aggressive posture, singled out Arthur. Maybe it was the walker, making him an easy, slow-moving target. Maybe it was the flag, a symbol of the very rights Peterson was about to violate. "You old man, I told you to move," Peterson shouted, though Arthur hadn't moved an inch, merely stood his ground. Arthur tried to speak, to explain he was just standing peacefully, but his words were lost in the rising chaos. Peterson, seeing only defiance in the old man's stance, unholstered his taser. "I said, move!" Peterson screamed, his voice cracking, a mix of fear and aggression. Before Arthur could fully comprehend what was happening, before any protester could intervene, Peterson fired the taser. The barb struck Arthur in the chest. 90 years of resilience, of history, of quiet dignity, crumpled as electricity coursed through his frail body. He cried out, a thin, pained sound, and collapsed onto the cold concrete. His walker clattered beside him, his small flag falling from his grasp, his VFW cap tumbling off to reveal thin white hair. Several protesters screamed, rushing forward to shield Arthur. "He's 90 years old. He's a veteran. What are you doing, you monsters?" A woman shouted at the police line, tears streaming down her face. Captain Miller, seeing the old man go down and the crowd's angry reaction, hesitated for a split second, perhaps realizing they'd crossed a line. But the damage was done. "Officer." Peterson stood frozen, taser still in hand, staring at the fallen veteran with wide, shocked eyes, the reality of his actions beginning to dawn. The peaceful protest had turned ugly, violent, all because of an unnecessary, brutal escalation against a non-violent elderly citizen. Amidst the chaos and shouting, as some protesters tried to render aid to Arthur and others angrily confronted the police line, one protester, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, a retired military, lawyer and veterans advocate, was already on her phone. She wasn't calling 911. Others were already doing that. She was calling a different kind of number, a direct line to a powerful figure in Washington, D.C., who had a particular interest in the welfare of veterans, especially those mistreated while exercising their constitutional rights. She spoke quickly, urgently. A 90-year-old veteran was just tased at a peaceful protest by overzealous police. She gave the location, the time, the nature of the protest. The voice on the other end listened intently, asked a few curt questions, then said simply, "Understood. Sit tight. Help is on the way." Less than 8 minutes later, the cacophony of the protest, the shouting, the sirens of approaching ambulances, Captain Miller's renewed bullhorn demands, was abruptly pierced by a new sound, the low, powerful thrum of multiple engines, accompanied by the near-silent whoosh of expensive tires on pavement. Heads turned. Even the riot police looked confused, sweeping around the corner, ignoring hastily erected police barricades as if they were minor inconveniences. Came a convoy of sleek black SUVs, not just one or two, but at least 5. Windows tinted to an impenetrable sheen, government plates just visible. They moved with silent, coordinated precision, radiating high-level security and absolute authority. The lead SUV pulled directly up to the plaza's edge, its doors opening before it had fully stopped. Men in dark, impeccably tailored suits emerged, earpieces glinting. They didn't draw weapons, but their presence, calm, watchful, intense, immediately shifted the power dynamic of the entire scene. They fanned out, creating a secure perimeter, not around the police, but subtly around the area where Arthur Jenkins lay, now being attended to by arriving paramedics. Captain Miller, seeing these unidentified, authoritative figures take control of his scene, strode forward, face flushed with anger. "Who the hell are you people?" he demanded. "This is a restricted police operation. You are interfering." One of the suited men, clearly the team leader, turned to face Captain Miller. He was tall, lean, expression unreadable. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held up a small leather-bound credential case, flipping it open to reveal a badge. That made Captain Miller stop dead in his tracks, his bluster deflating instantly. "Federal agents, Captain," the lead agent said coolly. "United States Secret Service, Dignitary Protection Detail, and a liaison from the Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of the Secretary. We're here for Mr. Arthur Jenkins." Miller stared, speechless. Secret Service? For this old protester? As Captain Miller struggled to process this, the rear door of the central black SUV opened. Another figure emerged, not a suited agent, but a woman of immense quiet authority. It was Eleanor Vance, the newly appointed Secretary of Veterans Affairs, a highly respected former four-star general herself, known for fierce advocacy of veterans' rights and intolerance for bureaucratic abuse. She had been in the city for a conference and received the urgent call from her Washington office, relayed from the protesters' contact just minutes earlier. Her face was a mask of cold fury as she surveyed the scene. The fallen elderly veteran, the riot police, the discarded protest signs. She walked directly toward where Arthur was being carefully placed on a stretcher, ignoring Captain Miller and the other officers. "Mr. Jenkins, Arthur," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle as she knelt beside him, taking his frail, trembling hand. "I am Eleanor Vance, Secretary of Veterans Affairs. I am so profoundly sorry for what has happened to you here today. This is an outrage." Arthur, groggy but conscious, looked up at her, confusion in his eyes. "Secretaries, but why?" "Because, Arthur," she said, her voice hardening as she glanced toward the police, "no one who served this nation, especially a veteran of your generation and sacrifice, should ever be treated this way for exercising their fundamental rights. Ever." She stood and faced Captain Miller, who had approached tentatively, now looking deeply apprehensive. "Captain," Secretary Vance began, her voice low but carrying absolute authority, "you and your officers have tased a 90-year-old unarmed peaceful protester, a decorated combat veteran of World War II. You have done so on public property during a permitted assembly. Explain yourself." Miller stammered about unlawful assembly, warnings to disperse, officer safety. Secretary Vance cut him off. "Officer safety? From a 90-year-old man with a walker holding a flag? Your department's definition of a threat appears catastrophically flawed, Captain, as is your understanding of the First Amendment." She turned to the lead Secret Service agent. "Agent Coulson, secure all body cam footage from the officers involved, as well as any city surveillance footage of this plaza for the last hour. I want a full federal review of this incident commencing immediately. The Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division will be formally notified by my office within the hour." Agent Coulson nodded. "Already in progress, Madam Secretary." The police officers, including Peterson, who looked ready to dissolve into the pavement, realized the situation had escalated far beyond a local protest issue. They were now facing a federal investigation initiated at the cabinet level. The arrival of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs and her Secret Service detail turned the local protest incident into a national news story. The image of the frail 90-year-old veteran being tased, contrasted with the swift, high-level federal intervention, sparked outrage across the country. Captain Miller and Officer Peterson were immediately suspended pending the federal investigation. The city's mayor and police chief found themselves issuing public apologies and promising sweeping reforms to protest policing and use of force policies, particularly concerning vulnerable populations. Arthur Jenkins was taken to the hospital, where Secretary Vance personally ensured he received the best possible care. His injuries from the tasing and fall were thankfully not life-threatening, but the emotional shock was significant. The secretary stayed with him until his family, contacted by her office, arrived. She assured them the VA would cover all medical expenses and that those responsible for his mistreatment would be held accountable. "This is not just about Arthur Jenkins, though his case is egregious," Secretary Vance told the press, who had descended on the hospital. "This is about a sacred promise to all who have served. Their right to speak, to assemble, to protest peacefully is not negotiable. It was bought with their sacrifice, and my department, along with every level of government, has a duty to protect that right, not trample it with excessive force and callous indifference." The black SUVs remained a quiet, powerful presence in the city for several days as the federal inquiry began. The message was clear. Veterans were not to be trifled with, and their rights were not to be dismissed, Arthur, recovering, became a reluctant symbol of resilience and the fight for justice. He never asked for the spotlight, but his quiet courage in the face of aggression and the powerful response it triggered reminded the nation that even the oldest soldiers still deserved the fiercest defenders when their fundamental freedoms were assaulted. Because when the rights of those who fought for all our rights are threatened, the response must be swift, decisive, and from the very top. Subscribe to Hidden Sparks if you believe in protecting our protectors, and that true. Authority stands for justice, not oppression.